Like many of you, I'm a big fan of the Lurie Garden, and so I know you will enjoy this talk from our first presenter of the day, Kathryn Deery. Kathryn serves as head horticulturist of Lurie Garden and is passionate about the vital role public gardens play in communities. Her goal is to maintain the design integrity of Lurie Garden while facilitating the garden's evolution. She aims to prioritize both the beauty and the ecological function of Lurie Garden while maintaining a high standard of horticulture. Kathryn previously held positions in horticulture and public programming at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Additionally, she worked in habitat restoration with the Golden Gate Parks Conservancy and served as a Conservation Corps North Bay AmeriCorps member. Kathryn earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science from the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Deery.
Thanks, Angela. Okay, welcome and good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and get started. All right, so thank you again for the introduction, Angela. And my name is Kathryn Deery. I'm the head horticulturist of Lurie Garden, and I've been in this position since early 2021. Just to start, I wanted to share that we have our website as well as Instagram, which you can get more information. Feel free to follow us for updates. And I did want to make the note that the pictures in my presentation today were taken by myself or the assistant horticulturist, Christian Brooks. You can also follow her at her Instagram, just to let you all know that. So to get started, I just wanted to orient everybody. Lurie Garden is located in Millennium Park, which is in downtown Chicago. You can see Lake Michigan is just to the east there. So very centrally located in the heart of the city. And to give everyone a little bit of context, the history behind the creation of Millennium Park is very long and winding and politically involved, and I won't go into that today. But you can see this is Millennium Park location in 1997. So in just a short 27 years, we've come a long way going from an empty or a full parking lot to a green space. So within Lurie Garden, or within Millennium Park, Lurie Garden is located in the southeast corner of the park. You can see it in its entirety here. So we're going to zoom in on Lurie Garden today. The garden the whole area I care for is 5 acres. The garden itself proper, the main kind of beds, if you will, are about 2.5 acres. The garden was designed in collaboration with the landscape architecture firm GGN, a lighting designer, Robert Israel, the perennial plant designer, P. Outoff, and then the bulb designer was brought on shortly after the installation, and she is Jacqueline Vanderkloot. And all parties, for the most part, are still quite involved. So today I'll be discussing how a designed and curated public garden, which is seen as a work of art, can evolve to infuse an ecological focus into the various aspects of the landscape design through our management practices. So I think we're all very familiar with this idea of naturalistic gardens and even natural spaces being described as messy. Messy is referring to a situation that is confused or difficult to deal with. This is how the average person still views naturalistic gardens, which is a bit unfortunate, but we can embrace that idea. And I'll be sharing how Lurie Garden is a curated and messy place at the same time, and we do this with intention. We're working towards that balance of naturalistic and curated, or messy and curated. And by doing this, we're beginning to shift the average visitor's thinking. I wanted to share with you this idea of cues to care, and this comes from an article written by Joan Iverson Nassar, and from an article titled Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. So the idea from this article is that the dominant culture in North America reads as a neat, orderly landscape is a sign of neighborliness, hard work, and pride. And neatness, people see that as meaning a person comes to a place and returns to it frequently. So neatness equals care. But we want to change that concept. And there's this great quote from the article that states, "What is good may not look good, and what looks good may not be good." So we can find ways to start to shift the way people see these natural and naturalistic spaces by doing a couple of things. And one, from again, an idea from the article, is designing orderly frames for these quote unquote messy ecosystems. The way that Lurie Garden accomplishes this is through that initial design of the hardscape and the hedge features around Lurie Garden. Those sharp lines and neat hardscape features do provide frames for this more wild and spontaneous perennial plant design that is at the center of the garden. In the article, she also talks about an idea of cues to care. The average person needs to be told that someone comes here and takes care of a place. So how do we do that for these naturalistic spaces? At Lurie Garden, we do it in a number of ways. The biggest one is that we have dedicated staff and volunteers for this garden. So just by walking through and simply seeing a person working in the garden at least 5 days a week and throughout the day tells you that this is an intentional, cared for space. We also pick up trash on a daily basis because we're in the middle of downtown and we get a whole range of garbage. We use an electric blower to clean up the paths, and we sweep the steps to keep those hardscape areas neat and tidy. We've added interpretive signage. We provide free tours to tell people that this place exists, that it's an intentional. And all of these things just lead to showing that this is a purposeful space, and that then allows the garden in all its messy glory to be the focus. So one way, I think, or a couple ways where we can introduce people to this idea of naturalistic gardens and being comfortable with messy ecosystems is through the winter garden, as well as how we prepare our gardens for spring. So first, focusing on winter interest, there's this idea that, or common practices that people often do still are, we rake up the leaves in the fall. We want to get a jump on cut back in the garden as early as possible. We blow out the garden so that we can see the bare earth, and then we bring back truckloads of mulch in to smother it back up. Those are all familiar concepts in the conventional landscaping world. And we're working to change that. And due to our prominent location, we can educate visitors on a new way of doing and thinking. So through winter interest, this is one avenue. The garden is seen as a 4-season garden, but really, in my view, and because I spend so much time in it, there's so many more seasons within those seasons. But that is the idea for this garden to be interesting at every point in the year. And Pete Aldow, the perennial plant designer, he considers the entire life cycle of a plant before including it in the design. What does it look like as it's emerging? What does it look like in bloom? How does it senesce? How does it stand up through the elements and through the winter? So all of that is considered, and we want to encourage people to think about the winter garden. There are some very obvious plants that work well for winter interest, as I'm sure you are all familiar. Coneflower being a big one. The seed heads stand up, they look great, they catch snow. But for example, Bistorida or mountain fleece, we have quite a few varieties of this plant. Turns to mush in the winter. So not every plant has to be suitable for winter interest, but it is worth considering and encouraging people to have a mix of plants that work well in the winter as well. But I'm not trying to say anything negatively about the Bastorta because, as you can see, it blooms a long time, has really interesting fall foliage, so it is a worthwhile plant. But it is important to consider the entire cycle. I also have found that in working in a naturalistic garden, there is a certain level of discomfort that people have to start to understand and get more comfortable with. So watching a plant kind of fade late in the season, die back, it can be uncomfortable to see. People don't understand it, don't like it. We're not trained to see the beauty in that. I find that we have to have patience in gardening in how we see a plant through its entire life cycle. This Panicum Dallas Blues is a perfect example where it's a great plant, it looks good, but when it goes to seed, it starts to get heavy and sort of splays open. And an average gardener might think, well, I'm going to cut this down before winter. It looks ugly. It's not doing anything for me. But with a little bit of patience and time, you can see that as it fully senesces, it pops back up. It provides great winter interest. And it's not just about the visual aspects. It's also about how a plant can provide kinetic energy. This grass moves beautifully in the wind and creates a rustling sound. And so there's a lot of aspects to the garden that go outside just the visual. I've also found in talking about winter interest with the average gardener, I try to encourage them to discover new details of a plant that have yet to be realized. A great example is this Vernonia, where it's a great plant. If we cut it back in the winter, we wouldn't yet get to see the unique details where the seed heads have a blush of pink and the leaves make this adorable kind of curly Q shape. So by spending time with a specific plant through its whole life cycle, we get to discover these new beautiful details, and it helps people understand the value of having a 4-season garden. And of course, when they begin to understand those aesthetic reasons to have a winter garden, they also start to understand and see the benefits it has for wildlife. So while those seed heads are interesting to look at, they also provide food for birds. And while leaving the garden up provides nesting material and habitat for small rodents, that then brings in bigger predators. So really talking about winter interest and aesthetics can then lead people into exploring the ecological benefits. So in the other aspect of this is preparing the garden for spring. This is a topic that is close to home, and I feel like an area we can really focus on in helping people better understand how to have a more naturalistic and ecologically minded garden. Typically, we cut down all the material, haul it away, and bring in mulch. That's the standard practice still for many landscapes. And our goal in Lurie Garden is to have a self-sufficient system, particularly regarding nutrients for the plants. We want to just use the material from the plants we have to provide the nutrients for the plants in the next season. And we also want to do what we can for overwintering insects by providing a diverse mix of opportunities. So one aspect of this in providing those opportunities for overwintering insects is creating habitat for stem nesting bees. So before I get into how we are handling this, I just want to quickly go through what that looks like. There is a somewhat smaller subset of bees that nest in the stem cavity of plants. And before we make our management choices, we need to understand the science and the life cycle behind these bees. So to provide this habitat for stem nesting bees, in spring, you cut back the flower stems, but leave a stubble that is 8 to 24 inches tall. And that cut, whether it is created by us, the gardener, or naturally, is an opening for these nesting bees to go in and lay their eggs in spring. The larvae develop, and in the summer, the foliage emerges, grows around that stem stubble, Everything's great, looks beautiful. We go into fall and winter, the bees are hibernating in those stems. And then come spring, we cut back the stems again, and that old stubble from the previous spring is still there. And adult bees will emerge from those cavities and find new stems to nest in. So the thing to take away from this is that it is over a year cycle that we need to be considering when providing habitat for stem nesting bees. So it is important to leave that stubble for 1.5 years. Now, what kind of stubble do we need? Hollow and pithy stems, the height, as I mentioned, 8 to 24 inches, and the diameter of the stem is important as well, an 1/8 to 5/16 inch. And I have a list of a few of the common stem nesting bees. So there are specific requirements, and not every plant is suitable for this. So when I started in 2021, I was aware that staff had been leaving these stem nesting zones, but I wanted to understand why and the process behind it a little bit better. So you can see in 2018, they started doing this. They had certain areas of the garden that were marked off as stem nesting zones, so treated differently in the cutback. And then they worked on increasing those areas and spread out further in the garden. And when they're making these decisions, they're also considering the fact that we have a very robust bulb design in Lurie Garden. And so how is that going to impact the aesthetics? So we are constantly trying to balance the aesthetics as well as ecological benefits. So when I started digging into this, I relied heavily on Heather Holmes. She's a pollinator conservationist and has written several books on specific pollinators. She was very helpful in exploring this topic. And what we did is we looked through our list of plants in Lurie Garden and came up with a short list of species that stem nesting bees do like or tend to use. And we made that list and we decided we would cut to 24 inches. There is the range that is recommended, but I found that it's easier, especially because we work with contractors, to just say 24 inches, and then inevitably you're going to get some variation of that just due to natural human error. So when we put together our list and compared it to the previous maps where they were doing the stem nesting zones, we realized the two things didn't really line up. So we had to rework our map. Looking across the garden, using that list of species, we identified areas that were more suited to stem nesting habitat. So you can see instead of those larger chunks, we have these little kind of islands throughout the garden. I did want to still have some areas that were completely undisturbed by the mulching mowers for those overwintering insects that are in leaf litter, and also those that need bare ground. So you can see in that upper right corner, that whole square, even though it has species that are not necessarily suited towards stem nesting bees, I did want that kind of undisturbed zone, and you can see those outer areas as well. So we had to rethink what we were doing based on the data and the information that we found. It's not enough to just say, well, I'm gonna, cut this area to 24 inches and call it a day if we don't have the right species that we're providing for the insects. So how do we do this practically? As I just mentioned, we do have contractors who come out and assist us with the cutback. It happens in 2 days. It just happened this week. It's a 5-person crew and they do it very quickly. What I do is I go out before and I mark out those areas with tape, and so the contractors can avoid those areas and then come back and manage them appropriately. So it's just a whole bunch of circles all over there. Here's a close-up picture of, you can see both the stubble from last year and then the new growth from this from 2023. So again, it's important. In last year, we marked all the zones we wanted for stem nesting. We need to make sure to mark those again for this season, because the bees that are nesting in there have yet to emerge. So it is good to have documentation and have a map to remember what you did the previous year in order to do this successfully. We use a variety of tools to complete our cutback. So there is a mulching mower that's set to its absolute highest that breaks up all the material elsewhere where we're not doing the stem nesting zones. And this material is all left in place to provide nutrients back to the garden. We don't bring in any outside mulch. We also use hedge trimmers, particularly for grasses so that crowns don't get damaged. And then in even more sensitive areas, we're using hedge shears to do this. So here again in process, they're working around the stem nesting zones. And then I've also marked grasses so that they can treat those a little bit differently. And here's a side-by-side of that 24 inches cut material. Next to the right, you have the area that's been completely mulched with the mower and then left in place. And here you can see then the bulbs and newly emerging perennial foliage coming up around those that high cut material, and it still looks nice and looks beautiful. So the other way that we are shifting the idea of this, shifting people's perception of naturalistic gardens and helping them think about it in a different way is changing this idea of maintenance to management of a garden. So maintenance implies that something doesn't change. You're preserving something, it's static. And this makes sense for like a painting or a sculpture. But for a living work of art, such as Lurie Garden, it makes much more sense to manage a space. And that term management is much more commonly used in ecological work and in the treatment of natural areas. But we need to use that term for how we approach our gardens and our design spaces as well. Because when we manage a space, it opens up more doors to us and allows more opportunities to use ecological practices to care for a garden. Maintenance does make sense in some ways, especially for a newly installed garden. This is another P. Outolf garden that was installed in 2020, and you can see how tight the design still is there in the clearly defined groups of plants. Maintenance makes sense when you are getting to know the garden and letting it get established in its first few years. And it also, when we're choosing maintenance versus management, this is dictated by the level of care a garden's going to receive. This garden here in Germany, it's taken care of by a contracted crew. They're not there every day. They come once or twice a week. They take care of the garden. They do a good job, but there isn't that same level of ownership and intimacy when somebody is there caring for the garden every single day. And without that sense of ownership, there isn't a level of comfort to make changes, to create opportunities for spontaneity, to increase diversity and opportunities for ecological benefits. I think one key factor in being able to manage rather than maintain a garden is having a designer involved, or if that is not possible, allowing for opportunities to constantly evaluate a garden. And by doing this, we can constantly assess the garden and decide, well, this plant spontaneously popped up here. Does it add something? Does it not? We can better keep things in balance by having that regular design involvement. Oops. So again, if you're a designer, considering the level of care a garden will receive after installation really dictates how you design a garden and how you manage a garden. And in Lurie Garden, we have a variety of design tactics that are used to create this very complex space. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of that. So block planting is where you have just a group of one species, 20 plants together, say, and it's simple. It's one species in a group. It's easier management. So when you're designing a space and you know that the care is not going to be as frequent, it can make sense to use more of a block style planting. We can still achieve the ecological benefits we want through block planting, but not as much as when we're able to have more intermingling. So the advantages of block planting, one are that you can create a wow. So just by the sheer density of a group of plants, such as this allium summer beauty, you get a wow with the density of blooms and the length of blooms. And you can see how it fits into Lurie Garden, where you have the block and then you have other plants mixed in around it. And this plant it's very simple to manage because you know what is supposed to be there and what is not. So it's helpful for weeding and managing the space. But even more importantly, when choosing whether a plant is designed as a block method or intermingling, is paying attention to how a plant grows and spreads and reproduces. So Pycnanthemum muticum, this is a wonderful native plant that we have in Lurie Garden, and it spreads rhizominously. It forms a block. So if you try to interplant this one, it doesn't really work very effectively. The plants in the middle of the pycnanthemum will get lost. So to have an effective design, you really need to understand how the plants move, grow, and spread. And also to achieve an impact through block planting, it's not just about the blooms. You can also consider what other things the plant might offer. And in the case of Amsonia, the fall foliage is completely stunning. And this plant is grouped in blocks and repeated throughout the light plate or sunny side of the garden. It provides repetition and balance. And then as the plants are kind of senescing and decreasing in biomass late in the season, this plant takes a primary role and really shines in the design. So this is a strategic move. Another photo of the Amsonia. So in addition to block planting, then we have intermingling or creating plant communities. And by intermingling plants, we can up the complexity and ultimately up the diversity within our garden, allowing for more opportunities for ecological benefits. This does require more attentive management and requires us to garden in a slightly different way. When creating these groups of plants, we have to consider whether the plant is stable or how long it lives. In this example, the Ceslaria is a very stable, easy plant. And then we add in the lobelia for kind of exciting interest. And this plant, lobelia, is short-lived. It seeds around. You've got the hosta in there providing a little bit of structure. But that's a very simple example of some intermingling that is done effectively. To up the level of complexity, we go to a mix of 5 different plants. There's a grass, there's Amsonia, and 3 other plants. And here, this is a good example where we're providing increased interest because of the different flower shapes. But by doing this, it looks more interesting, but it's also providing a more diverse opportunity for a range of insects to come and be pollinators in the garden by having those different flower shapes. And also at Lurie Garden, we're trying to show examples of interesting and unique shade planting. We're trying to encourage people to think outside of the hosta box and increase the diversity in their shade plantings. And this is possible with the insane amount of sedges we can use, as well as unique ephemerals and ferns and bulbs. And so we can really create a interesting, diverse shade landscape as well by intermingling plants. And because in this area here in the corner is an even higher level of intermingling and diversity, and kind of up front, it looks a little bit chaotic. And you can see there's a lot going on in there. But when you start to break it down, it is very purposeful. And I like to think of when you start to intermingle, it's helpful to think of the old adage with container design, thrillers, fillers, and spillers. To have effective intermingling, it's important to have low ground cover species that suppress weeds and spread and move around, filler plants, and then tall, narrow plants that tend to seed around on their own and provide that kind of spontaneous level of interest. And the goal with this intermingling of plants is we are trying to ultimately create a stable plant community that is highly diverse, but it does take some experimentation, some evaluating and monitoring on our part, and that's where the higher level of management comes into play. So I can easily look at this space and say, okay, I can see that the Ruellia is getting out of hand. It's starting to take over the space and remove some of it. And once we understand both sides of these design ideas, the block and the intermingling, we can bring them together. And this is where a naturalistic garden truly shines, in that it's a natural space using natives, non-native ornamentals, combining the block and intermingling. We have a spontaneous, diverse garden, but it's still legible to the average visitor that walks through. And that's why it's so very impactful. Often I hear people get frustrated because they get excited about native plants or whatever type of plant, and they buy 20 different plants and then put them all together, and they don't like how it looks. And so I suggest that people think about a plant's growth habit and have that influence the design. And when people come to me and say, how can I do this in my yard? I say, one way to go about it is to think about putting a gallery wall in your house. First, you have to choose the paint color of the wall and say it's green. And then you start to add in the framed pieces, and those are your additional plant species to add more complexity. So in Lurie Garden, we use Sporobolus heterolepis as kind of our backdrop, our base, and then we add in additional species to create complexity. In the shade, we use Carex as our base plant, and then we add in additional species to create complexity and interest. So it's helpful when we're sharing with people how to make their garden more diverse and complex, to start simply and then work up from there. And you can see it's all about balance and repetition. It's a highly diverse garden, but we do have species repeated across the whole space. And again, this helps with legibility. Here you can see that white cloud is Euphorbia correlata, repeated across the landscape, as well as Limonium is that pale kind of dusty pink flower. And these plants, they are repeated in groups, but they're not in big blocks, because if you look at the amount of space it takes up on the actual ground level, it's pretty small. And to achieve repetition and balance, you don't have to just create big blocks. Again, you can use one individual, very eye-catching species such as bottle gentian and repeat it throughout the garden to make the whole space feel connected when that plant is in bloom. And it just spontaneously pops up through all your other planting, connecting it still together. So balance and repetition. So I wanted to also talk about when we're working towards a naturalistic garden and using ecologically sensitive maintenance practices, we do encounter a lot of contradictions, and we are balancing this idea of, it's a designed and curated space, but we also want to be ecologically minded. How do we make those two work together? Especially because the garden, when it was created, didn't necessarily have those same exact goals. And some aspects of the original design, as well as the location of the garden being in the middle of downtown, are fairly contradictory to this goal of being naturalistic and ecologically minded. And it's not that I'm trying to negatively talk about the garden. It's more that each garden and natural space, it's unique in its history, its creation, and the parameters within which it's built. So how we approach these spaces, adapt them, and evolve them will differ space to space. So I'm going to go through a few examples here in Lurie Garden. The Salvia River, this is an iconic feature of Lurie Garden, yet I would also consider it a curse of Lurie Garden. This is in 2008. The garden is only 4 years old. You can see the Salvia River, that purple strip running down the center of the light plate or the sunny side of the garden. And if you Google Lurie Garden, the Salvia River comes up often, more often than not, in photos. And it has just been kind of a constant issue for staff to deal with. Because this looks amazing. It creates a wow. It is symbolic and references the Chicago River. But it's also a monoculture of salvia. And this species is clump forming, so there is a lot of space between the individual plants, leaving opportunities for weeds to move in. And also, for salvia, once it's past its peak bloom, the seed heads aren't entirely that interesting, and it really doesn't have, I would say, a super interesting structure later on. So what do? Do we just keep shoving salvia into the river and hitting our heads against the wall of why it looks kind of ugly after that peak bloom? No. So staff over time and prior to me started adding other species into the Salvia River to create more complexity and to create less of a monoculture. And what they did is they added plants that came up later on in the season. So the salvia finishes its peak bloom, and then you can see the Sporobolus starts to emerge, and Monarda. We have a little bit of Schizocerium in there, and then the Echinacea pallida starts to go. And the really cool thing that has happened is, one, the Sporobolus looks fabulous in the fall, and then two, the Echinacea pallida are super happy seeding around, and they've essentially created a tributary through the river, and they create a whole secondary wow in that same place where the river was. So by adding more diversity and working with the timing of perennials, we were able to kind of work through that issue of the Salvia River. Still a work in progress, but much improved. The other feature of Lurie Garden that is a bit of a tough one is the hedge. So that goes along that north end, and then the west side, you can see it's a pretty big behemoth of a thing. There's about 15 to 1,800 individual trees that make up that hedge. And it requires a good amount of pruning and shearing and additional resources dedicated to make it look good. So this thing is a iconic feature of Lurie Garden, but is it necessarily sustainable? And what we realized, though, while it does demand a lot of resources, it does provide wonderful habitat for birds and wildlife. It's a whole secret kind of wonderland in there. And we've even gotten together with a local organization to get a trail camera to start monitoring the wildlife that does pass through our hedge. Because if you look again, this is kind of a pathway from, this is a busy road over here, and I've literally seen a fox cross this road, come through the hedge, and then go out the other way. So it does provide kind of a safe corridor for mammals as well as nesting opportunities for birds. While we are not really able to change the main hedge because it is such this iconic feature and so ingrained in the design of Lurie Garden, there was an opportunity to change some other hedging. Along the street level, there's to the south and to the east of the garden were these zones that had hedging, and previous staff, I think in 2018, converted to these areas to what's known as the bird border. They removed boxwood, used basic hedging, and replaced the plant material with a mix of woody species that are all native and well suited towards birds and wildlife of our area. So while we can't change some things, we can continue to adapt and evolve other areas of the garden that add ecological benefits, but don't affect the overall design integrity. Another contradiction in Lurie Garden is we say no deadheading because the seed heads are interesting and they provide food for the birds, but that's not entirely true. We will deadhead in the case of editing plant material. Chesmanthium, it's a beautiful plant. I love it. I love the seed heads, but it does seed around and spread out of the areas that we really want it to be in and can tend to start to take over certain zones. So we will selectively deadhead Chesmanthium, as well as Penstemon digitalis is another plant that is just overly successful in Lurie Garden, where it has beautiful blooms, it has interesting fall color, and even the color of the leaves when it emerges in the spring is really nice. But it can tend to take over. You can see in the forefront of this picture, that's just all penstemon. And it starts to dominate the design. And this is where we come in and where those management aspects come in, and we remove plants to bring the balance back in and make sure that one plant doesn't completely take over. I think the biggest and most obvious contradiction in Lurie Garden is that it is a mix of native and non-native ornamental plants within the design. People often come into Lurie Garden thinking that it's entirely native, but it is not in its design. And how do we make that work? So here are a few examples of natives and non-natives working together. The Astrantia is a non-native, but working beautifully with the Monarda and the penstemon to create a really nice combination. And here we love the Galenia, the Bowman's root. It provides fabulous fall color. We really love the Eutrochium, Joe Pye weed. Good for birds, has an interesting structure, but we pair these then with the aconitum, that bright blue of the monk's hood, and the airiness of the millennia, and we've taken that design up a notch. And this is a good example to share with the average gardener or the average visitor of, you can begin to include more and more natives into your design. You don't have to get rid of every single ornamental right away. It can be a process, and you can have both existing together. This is another example with more of that mountain fleece, the Bistorta, working with Galenia again, the New England aster in the background there on the left, and then on the right working with the tufted hairgrass. So we have a lot of examples of natives and non-native ornamentals working together. I do want to make the point though that Pete Audolph and the Lurie Garden staff as well, we do not choose plants that are known invasives and known issues, and we are constantly monitoring the effects of the plants that we include. And when plants are chosen, part of Pete Audolph's style and aesthetic is to choose plants that are as close to that kind of original species form as possible. We don't have double flowers or anything too crazy like that. And so, here's an example of a non-native Sanguisorba, but we also have the native Sanguisorba as well in the garden. Another really cool plant where we're trying to add more of that. A cool combination with Caloroe and geranium. Caloroe has really impressed me as a native plant, as using this native plant in design. It's got that insane root. It trails beautifully. And this was a picture that my coworker took of it being used in the median in a street where it's such a tough plant. And it looks really awesome. So more fun ways to use natives. We do have situations where the ornamentals just are not working out. In the case of a stilbe that was planted in full sun in the garden, we're not going to go out of our way to just water that one species that needs extra water. It's just not appropriately placed. So coming up this year, we will be replacing that with a native, with the Penstemon hirsutus. Another example of an ornamental not working is the Anemone splendens. This plant is too successful, too aggressive. We can't keep it in check. So we are looking at some different options for replacing this plant. But we also have examples where native plants are not quite working well for us anymore. The Sambucus canadensis in the bird border. It's a great plant. provides ecological resources, but it is beginning to take over this whole zone, and we can't restrict it. And we do want a certain level of diversity in our small space. If we were able to just let it go wild, go crazy and fill up that whole zone, that could be an option, but then we would lose out on diversity. Hydrophyllum virginianum, another great early emerging native, covers the ground quickly in the spring, has these nice flowers, but it does start to take over our areas in the shade and reduces diversity. So we're looking at how much do we control that, move it to areas where it can just run rampant and be free. We also have natives in the garden where we're trying to add more of them, and we're doing this by testing them out in different design combinations. Dahlia purpurea, love this plant. The only thing we struggle with is the rabbits eat it pretty much right after we plant it. So we're just trying different techniques to add more of this plant to the garden. And the same thing with the Monarda bradburyana. I can't sing the praises of this plant enough. It looks great in bloom. It kind of sporadically spreads around the garden without being overly competitive. So we're trying to add more of that one. And Asclepias verticillata, this was a plant that Pete Outall fell in love with in his last visit, and now he's asking us to try it in a number of different situations. And by doing this, we can again explore how to create different plant communities and to work towards finding these successful, stable plant communities by trying these plants in different areas. Carex plantagenea, another lovely native, has this cute iris-like foliage. We have it in a couple locations in the garden, but we're realizing it's not as competitive as, say, you can see the hydrophyllum kind of sneaking in that photo, takes over the carex. So we are realizing we need to add this plant in bigger masses. And these are all things we're learning as we're going and then trying to share them with the public, the visitors, our fellow horticulturists, to help everyone figure out how best to use natives in a design space. And lastly, kind of the biggest contradiction that is both great and not great is that we are a space for people and wildlife. Our goal is to create this urban oasis for both humans and wildlife. For many people who live in the city, this is their backyard, this is their nature. And so we want to provide that opportunity for people who live in this urban setting. It's also a place for people to relax and recharge. And we see regulars who walk through every morning or have their morning coffee. And for wildlife, it's a place to access necessary resources. Perhaps it's just a stop-off point for wildlife, or where an entire life cycle is completed. And the amazing thing about this garden is that it's a place for special moments for both humans and wildlife. And when these things come together, it's both awesome, but also can create some unique situations. This last spring, we had a fox create its den in one of our tree wells, and it had a litter of 6 kits. So we had these adorable little fox kits running around the garden, and we were trying to keep hush hush on it and protect them best as possible, but the media caught wind, and I was coming in every morning to news cameras set up, photographers, everybody trying to get a glimpse of these fox kits, which I don't blame them. And I want people to be excited and learn from this experience. But the people were also starting to encroach on the animal space. So we had to start devising ways to add barriers to keep people a certain distance away from where the foxes were exploring and using the space. We trained the park security staff on how to interact with wildlife and how to manage these barriers. We added new signage to teach people about how to coexist with a red fox. And it was kind of a stressful experience, but also one of the most magical and amazing experiences I've had so far in my gardening career. And so you can see these little guys, they can get in and out of those barriers, but it's just to give them a little space from people. And just all this to say, like, it's a challenge to work with our different circumstances, and we have these goals to create a more naturalistic, ecologically minded garden. And it can be hard, but we will always be continuing to work to find new ways to evolve, to adapt, and be better. So that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was fabulous. I loved the ending with the foxes. We have a few minutes for some questions and answers. Everybody's been posting those, but if you haven't posted your questions already, feel free to post those directly in the chat. And anything that we don't get to within the next few minutes, we can address in the speaker garden for track 2. So I'm reading from the chat, and some of these may have been answered already, but I'll read through them. One person wanted thoughts on how to translate the idea that the signs of care, the presence of dedicated staff, can help people adapt to the aesthetic of a wild garden in residential gardens. And how can those of us who are communicating with residential owners and HOAs help to usher in a new aesthetic along with the native plant kind of fads to help make this a lasting paradigm? Do you have any advice for residential designers?
Sure. I think, something I've seen with adding prairies to a residential landscape is mowing a path down the center of the prairie, or kind of a winding path. So having a mown path in the middle is just a small way of telling people, like, I use this space, I move in this space. I think getting creative with our paths is one way to do it. I think even creating your own little sign, like if you have something interesting in bloom, you can get like a little chalkboard sign and write what the plant is and stick it next to the plant in your front yard so that people walking by can figure out what it is. So I mean, that is a really good question. I think it's these subtle, obvious things where just kind of keeping the edges neat and tidy. And, perhaps you have your mixed native planting, but then there's some shrubs that are strategically placed so that it kind of frames out the space a little bit better.
That's great. Can you explain the criteria Heather used for choosing which plants to use for stem nesting?
Yeah.
So, this person doesn't use many of the plants you listed, but believe they have other ones that could be used.
There's a better list on the University of Minnesota Extension website that I referenced. They have a more comprehensive list. And going back to what I was saying, it's about the diameter of the cavity of the plant, so that 1/8 to 5/16 inch, hollow, kind of pithy stems. And so if something is too wide or too small, it's not going to be suitable for insect nesting. And what Heather told us was, these are things we know, like plants in the Asteraceae family are definitely a good option, but begin to just test some other ones on your own. So each year we're trying to add a few things. Like we added Kurangashoma, which is an ornamental plant, and Heather thought, well, maybe it could be an option. So we're trying that this year. So I think it is a little bit of trial and error, and something we'd like to get better at is better monitoring of how these habitats are being used, because I mean, we need a staff entomologist for that. But yeah, I would recommend going to her website. She also has an Instagram and some books, and then that University of Minnesota Bee Lab is helpful as well.
Okay. Do you allow seeds to freely scatter during spring mowing? How does this impact the legibility of the perennial design?
Yeah, we allow them to scatter freely. I would say making that choice depends on the level of care you're able to provide, because again, we're here 40 hours a week. I don't worry about it because if there's too much of something or if it's out of place, I can catch it pretty easily. But that is a good thought. If you have something that's known to be overly competitive or spreading too much in your garden, go ahead and take off those seed heads right before you do your cutback. So you're still getting the winter interest and providing the resources to wildlife, but then saving yourself some work later.
Okay. And how do you deal with invasive plants in such a dense and intermingled garden where this person lives? A garden like this would be invaded and taken over by witchgrass, dandelion, and or goutweed.
Oh, it's a battle. I mean, I would say we definitely deal with weeds. One of our worst is bindweed. That is a hard one for us. We also don't get overly stressed about things that the strawberry or the dandelion that is just kind of scattered throughout. We'll worry about that kind of later in the season when there's less work. But I would say getting to these plants, obviously before they go to seed. You can try, if you have an area that's densely invaded, you could try using cardboard to smother those weeds. We don't use any chemical methods, but if that is something you are interested in your toolkit, you can use that. But it is a constant battle. I will say what helps is densely planting the garden. So when installing a garden, think about the spacing perennials a foot to maybe max a foot and a half apart, and having just a dense planting from the get-go really will help long term.
Okay. I think we have time for this last one really quick before going to the speaker garden. When testing out a new plant in the garden, like the world milkweed, are you planting a block, excuse me, in an area of the garden, or I lost my page, or do you hide smaller quantities throughout an established area?
I would say it's a combination. With that milkweed, it's in a prominent area. It's not working, so we don't want it really just with that plant. I don't think it will work as well as just a straight block. So we've got it mixed into different perennials in 3 different spots to just really see like if it still likes that spot and like how it looks with other plants. So when we're testing out new plants, we're not necessarily like hiding them from people or anything. We're just putting them right out there and seeing how it works.
Okay. Well, great. Again, thank you for your time and your commitment to sustainability.